3. Guerrilla tactics. Che smoking his pipe in the mountains of Bolivia. In military language, tactics are the practical methods of achieving the grand strategic objectives. In one sense, they complement strategy, and in another, they are more specific rules within it. As means, tactics are much more variable, much more flexible than the final objectives, and they should be adjusted continually during the struggle. There are tactical objectives that remain constant throughout a war and others that vary. The first thing to be considered is the adjusting of guerrilla action to the action of the enemy. The fundamental characteristic of a guerrilla band is mobility. This permits it in a few minutes to move far from a specific theater and in a few hours far even from the region, if that becomes necessary, permits it constantly to change front and avoid any type of encirclement. As the circumstances of the war require, the guerrilla band can dedicate itself exclusively to fleeing from an encirclement, which is the enemy's only way of forcing the band into a decisive fight that could be unfavorable. It could also change the battle into a counter-encirclement. Small bands of men are presumably surrounded by the enemy when suddenly the enemy is surrounded by stronger contingents, or men located in a safe place serve as a lure leading to the encirclement and annihilation of the entire troops and supply of an attacking force. Characteristic of this war of mobility is the so-called minuet, named for the analogy with the dance. The guerrilla bands encircle an enemy position, an advancing column, for example. They encircle it completely from the 4 points of the compass, with 5 or 6 men in each place, far enough away to avoid being encircled themselves. The fight is started at any one of the points, and the army moves toward it. The guerrilla band then retreats, always maintaining visual contact, and initiates its attack from another point. The army will repeat its action and the guerrilla band the same. Thus, successively, it is possible to keep an enemy column immobilized, forcing it to expend large quantities of ammunition and weakening the morale of its troops without incurring great dangers. This same tactic can be applied at nighttime, closing in more and showing greater aggressiveness, because in these conditions, counter-encirclement is much more difficult. Meanwhile, by night is another important characteristic of the guerrilla band, enabling it to advance into position for an attack and, where the danger of betrayal exists, to mobilize in new territory. The numerical inferiority of the guerrilla makes it necessary that attacks always be carried out by surprise. This great advantage is what permits the guerrilla fighter to inflict losses on the enemy without suffering losses. In a fight between 100 men on one side and 10 on the other, losses are not equal, where there is 1 casualty on each side. The enemy loss is always repairable. It amounts to only 1% of his effectiveness. The loss of the guerrilla band requires more time to be repaired because it involves a soldier of high specialization and is 10% of the operating forces. A dead soldier of the guerrillas ought never to be left with his arms and his ammunition. The duty of every guerrilla soldier whenever a companion falls is to recover immediately these extremely precious elements of the fight. In fact, the care which must be taken of ammunition and the method of using it are further characteristics of guerrilla warfare. In any combat between a regular force and a guerrilla band, it is always possible to know one from the other by their different manner of fire. A great amount of firing on the part of the regular army, sporadic and accurate shots on the part of the guerrillas. Once one of our heroes, now dead, had to employ his machine guns for nearly 5 minutes, burst after burst, in order to slow up the advance of enemy soldiers. This fact caused considerable confusion in our forces, because they assumed from the rhythm of fire that key position must have been taken by the enemy, since this was one of the rare occasions where departure from the rule of saving fire had been called for because of the importance of the point being defended. Another fundamental characteristic of the guerrilla soldier is his flexibility, his ability to adapt himself to all circumstances and to convert to his service all of the accidents of the action. Against the rigidity of classical methods of fighting, the guerrilla fighter invents his own tactics at every minute of the fight and constantly surprises the enemy. In the first place, there are only elastic positions, specific places that the enemy cannot pass, and places of diverting him. Frequently, the enemy, after easily overcoming difficulties in a gradual advance, is surprised to find himself suddenly and solidly detained without possibilities of moving forward. This is due to the fact that the guerrilla defended positions, when they have been selected on the basis of a careful study of the ground, are invulnerable. It is not the number of attacking soldiers that counts, but the number of defending soldiers. Once the number has been placed there, it can nearly always hold off a battalion with success. It is a major task of the chiefs to choose well the moment and the place for defending a position without retreat. The form of attack of a guerrilla army is also different. Starting with surprise and fury, irresistible, it suddenly converts itself into total passivity. The surviving enemy, resting, believes that the attacker has departed. He begins to relax, to return to the routine life of the camp or the fortress, when suddenly a new attack bursts forth in another place, and the same characteristics, while the main body of the guerrilla band lies in wait to intercept reinforcements. At other times, an outpost defending the camp will be suddenly attacked by the guerrilla, dominated, and captured. The fundamental thing is surprise and rapidity of attack. Acts of sabotage are very important. It is necessary to distinguish clearly between sabotage, a revolutionary and highly effective method of warfare, and terrorism, a measure that is generally ineffective and indiscriminate in its results, since it often makes victims of innocent people and destroys a large number of lives that would be valuable to the revolution. Terrorism should be considered a valuable tactic when it is used to put to death some noted leader of the oppressing forces, well known for his cruelty, his efficiency in repression, or other quality that makes his elimination useful. But the killings of persons of small importance is never advisable, since it brings on an increase of reprisals, including deaths. There is one point very much in controversy in opinions about terrorism. Many consider that its use, by provoking police oppression, hinders all more or less legal or semi-clandestine contact with the masses and makes impossible unification for actions that will be necessary at a critical moment. This is correct, but it also happens that in a civil war, the repression by the governmental power in certain towns is already so great that, in fact, every type of legal action is suppressed already, and any action of the masses that is not supported by arms is impossible. It is therefore necessary to be circumspect in adopting methods of this type and to consider the consequences that they may bring for the revolution. At any rate, well-managed sabotage is always a very effective arm, though it should not be employed to put means of production out of action, leaving a sector of the population paralyzed, and thus without work, unless this paralysis affects the normal life of the society. It is ridiculous to carry out sabotage against a soft drink factory, but it is absolutely correct and advisable to carry out sabotage against a power plant. In the first case, a certain number of workers are put out of a job, but nothing is done to modify the rhythm of industrial life. In the second case, there will again be displaced workers, but this is entirely justified by the paralysis of the life of the region. We will return to the technique of sabotage later. One of the favorite arms of the enemy army, supposed to be decisive in modern times, is aviation. Nevertheless, this has no use whatsoever during the period that guerrilla warfare is in its first stages, with small concentrations of men in rugged places. The utility of aviation lies in the systematic destruction of visible and organized defenses, and for this there must be large concentrations of men who construct these defenses, something that does not exist in this type of warfare. Planes are also potent against marches by columns through level places or places without cover. However, this latter danger is easily avoided by carrying out the marches at night. One of the weakest points of the enemy is transportation by road and railroad. It is virtually impossible to maintain a vigil yard by yard over a transport line, a road, or a railroad. At any point, a considerable amount of explosive charge can be planted that will make the road impassable, or by exploding it at the moment that a vehicle passes, a considerable loss in lives and material to the enemy is caused at the same time that the road is cut. The sources of explosives are varied. They can be brought from other zones, or use can be made of bombs seized from the dictatorship, though these do not always work, or they can be manufactured in secret laboratories within the guerrilla zone. The technique of setting them off is quite varied. Their manufacture also depends upon the conditions of the guerrilla band. In our laboratory, we made powder which we used as a cap, and we invented various devices for exploding the mines at the desired moment. The ones that gave the best results were electric. The first mine that we exploded was a bomb dropped from an aircraft of the dictatorship. We adapted it by inserting various caps and adding a gun with the trigger pulled by a cord. At the moment that an enemy truck passed by, the weapon was fired to set off the explosion. These techniques can be developed to a high degree. We have information that in Algeria, for example, tele-explosive mines, that is, exploded by radio at great distances from the point where they are located, are being used today against the French colonial power. The technique of lying in ambush along roads in order to explode mines and annihilate survivors is one of the most remunerative in point of ammunition and arms. The surprised enemy does not use his ammunition and has no time to flee, so with a small expenditure of ammunition, large results are achieved. As blows are dealt the enemy, he also changes his tactics, and in place of isolated trucks, veritable motorized columns move. However, by choosing the ground well, the same result can be produced by breaking the column and concentrating forces on one vehicle. In this case, the essential elements of guerrilla tactics must always be kept in mind. These are perfect knowledge of the ground, surveillance and foresight as to the lines of escape, vigilance over all the secondary roads that can bring support to the point of attack, intimacy with people in the zone so as to have sure help from them in respect to supplies, transport, and temporary or permanent hiding places if it becomes necessary to leave wounded companions behind, numerical superiority at a chosen point of action, total mobility, and the possibility of counting on reserves. If all these tactical requests are fulfilled, surprise attack along the lines of communication of the enemy yields notable dividends. A fundamental part of guerrilla tactics is the treatment accorded the people of the zone. Even the treatment accorded the enemy is important. The norm to be followed should be an absolute inflexibility at the time of attack, an absolute inflexibility toward all the despicable elements that resort to informing and assassination, and clemency as absolute as possible toward the enemy soldiers who go into the fight performing or believing that they perform a military duty. It is a good policy so long as there are no considerable bases of operations and invulnerable places to take no prisoners. Survivors ought to be set free. The wounded should be cared for with all possible resources at the time of the action. Conduct toward the civil population ought to be regulated by a large respect for all the rules and traditions of the people of the zone, in order to demonstrate effectively, with deeds, the moral superiority of the guerrilla fighter over the oppressing soldier. Except in special situations, there ought to be no execution of justice without giving the criminal an opportunity to clear himself.